Hi everyone, Stepan here. It's Thursday, so welcome to another Thursday endgame video. Today we are going to go over part 2 of opposite colored bishop endgames. As opposed to last week's video, this video is going to be slightly more complicated, and we are going to go over advanced or, well, intermediate opposite color bishop endgames, theoretical endgames. And then in part 3 we will go over more advanced stuff, and then in part 4 we will go over practical opposite color bishop endgames, which are most likely to occur in your own games. Okay, today we are going to go over positions when the attacker has 2 extra pawns, which are the most complicated positions to learn theoretically, when the pawns are apart, when they are not connected. In the previous video you can look at the positions with 1 extra pawn, doubled extra pawns, and 2 pawns which are connected. Positions with 3 extra pawns are generally easy to win, so they again are on the other side of the spectrum. These are the most complicated. Okay, so when the pawns are apart, the first rule that should be considered at all points: the farther the pawns are from each other, it's easier to win. If the pawns are 4 or 5 files apart, the position is just easy to win. We are therefore going to be considering positions with 2 and 3 files apart. In today's video, we are going to go over positions with 2 files apart. Mostly, positions when the pawns are 3 files apart are much easier to win, because the defender's bishop and the defender's king don't have an easy way to control both pawns, and we are going to see that technique is used here. If the pawns are only 1 file apart, then the position is a very easy draw, unless your bishop and king are, I don't know, in this case on a1 and h1 or something like that. So if your king and bishop can set up a blockade, then it's an easy draw. There is no way for the attacker to make progress, and I'm going to try to show you how. For example, in this position, white plays king e5. There is just no way to go around and evict this bishop and push 1 pawn forward. What the attacker wants to do is advance the pawns up to a point where the defender is going to have to give up his bishop for one of the pawns. When the pawns are only 1 file apart, there simply isn't enough room to maneuver. That's one point. The second point is the defender's bishop can usually control both pawns by itself, and if the king is nearby, then it requires basically no technique. Black can simply wait here, for example, king f5, bishop c3, king g5, king e7. There's just no way to go around, and now if you try to go here, the black king picks up this pawn. This pawn is defended by the bishop. Let me just show this simple position once more. For example, if you have the starting position here, if the pawns are on their original squares, for example, if white continues king to f2, you don't even have to think. As long as you can set up the blockade, you can draw this easily. So if I'm black, I would just play king f6, which is simplest, and after something like e4, just king f7, and I don't know, king to e2, trying to go around, king to f8, and that's it. There is no way for white to make progress. Whatever he does, once I set up my perfect position, and this is my perfect position, everything is blockaded, I know that white is not going to be able to win. There is just no way to win. So whatever white tries from here on, I will be able to set up a defense. Now, of course, there are going to be extreme cases where your pawns are going to be when the attacker's pawns are going to be too far away from your king and bishop, and then you could lose, but that's really unlikely. Okay, now let's look at the hard positions. When the pawns are 2 files apart, you should make a mental note about the difference of the pawns being on bishop, rook, or knight files. Let's say one of the pawns is a central pawn, in which case the other pawn can either be a knight file or a rook file, or a knight file pawn or a rook file pawn. Otherwise, the pawns cannot be 2 files apart. If the pawns are both on bishop, if both pawns are on bishop files, then it's 2 files apart. One rule, the first rule, is if the pawns are on bishop files, it's generally easier to win. Okay, it's much easier to win. Why? Because your king, the attacker's king, has enough room to go around and has enough room to evict the defender's bishop, and to basically, in this case, get either to e6 to herd this pawn forward, or get to b7 to evict the bishop and herd this pawn forward. Okay, what you see on the board is a study by Yuri Averbach, which is used in Dvoretsky's Endgame manual. It's in 100 Endgames You Must Know. And I believe it's in every Endgame book, because this is the most basic position which shows you the best defensive try, which is why I wanted to focus on this position too. And the best defensive setup is trying to control both pawns with your bishop. Now, that's just one part of the position. That's what you sometimes could set up. The other part is not allowing the attacker's king in. You have to control the position in a way that doesn't allow either of the pawns to move forward. If one of the pawns moves forward, then you basically lose, depending on the position. But if the pawns can advance, that's a bad thing. So if you can control both pawns, the first thing you need to do is control them both on the same diagonal with your bishop. The second thing is you need to control, how do I put this? The pawn that's stopped by the bishop and not blockaded by the bishop. So in this case, the f3 pawn, which is stopped by the bishop, and the c6 pawn is blockaded. So you want your king to be controlling the pawn that's stopped by your bishop. So in this case, you want your king to be stopping the f3 pawn from moving to f4. That's crucial. The harder part is also using your king to stop your opponent's king from moving into the position. Okay, so in this study, which is fairly simple once you go over it a couple of times, it's simple to understand. Black uses both of these techniques to draw. I'm going to show you how. So white plays king to d5. Obviously, if the king gets to e6 into the position, then it's going to be much harder or even lost. Okay, so in this case, black can afford one move. Okay, so bishop to b8 in this case. There is no progress to be made. If king to e6 in this position, then black can start harassing this pawn and win the pawn. So it's still not that easy. And of course the bishop can pick up the other pawn. So after bishop to b8, king to c5 played, and the white king tries to go around into the position. Okay, bishop to c7, waiting, king to d5. Okay, and now in this position, I'm going to show you a losing move. And if you want, you can pause the video to try and figure out why it's a losing move. When I was trying to solve the study for the first time, when I was trying to draw with black for the first time, I lost because of this move, so I think it's important. I played the move king to f4. Now, the move king to f4 is now obviously losing for me, but try to see why. Okay, if you haven't paused the video, pause it now. It loses because in this position, white is able to play the move bishop g4. And after the move bishop g4, you basically have no good moves. You have to play something like king to g5. And after king to e6, there is no way to stop the pawns from moving forward. After something like bishop to b8, king to d7, you can see that black is going to have to give up his bishop and lose. So king f4 is a horrible blunder. So after king to d5, you have to play king to f6, or you can play king to f6. And in this position, if bishop to g4 is played, you can simply continue with bishop to g3, as I'm going to show you. But first, let's look at the critical move, king to c5. And now the idea is, if the king tries to get into the position this way, we are going to be blockading it with our king, as we are doing it now. And if the king tries to get to b7, which would be a winning move, if the bishop couldn't be defended, then our king is going to defend the bishop from d8 and either force white to move this pawn and lose the pawn, or force white to move the king away, in which case we would move our king to e7 and draw simply. So let's see what happens. King e7, for example, king to b5, let's say king to d8. At this point, black could also wait with something like bishop f4, bishop g3, bishop d6. Wouldn't really matter too much, because king to d8 could be played and then bishop back to c7. You just have to watch out for Zugzwang tricks, because every position is specific, but basically you want to be able to defend your bishop when the attacker's king comes in to chase it away from the blockading square. So okay, king to d8, which is the safest move, king to a6, king to e7, king to b7, king to d8. And now once your king moves, or if the bishop moves, you move your bishop. Of course, you don't lose your bishop. If the king moves back, then you can move your king and an easy draw. But After king to f6, if white tries to wait with his bishop, if white tries to not give up this idea of entering the position with king to e6, if he just waits with bishop to g4, again, I'm going to show you a move I lost with, which again seems like a very obvious losing move now, but when I was doing it for the first time, it was very hard. So again, try to pause the video and see why king e7 is a losing move. Okay, so king e7 is a losing move because it allows the move king to e4. And now, after king e4, the f4 pawn can no longer be stopped, and the c6 pawn can be defended. And now white is making progress, which is going to make it very easy to win the position. Of course, the farther the pawns are up the board, it becomes easier to win, unless the defender's king can win one of the pawns. So if I can move my pawn to, let's say, f6 with my king on g5, then the position becomes easier to play. So for example, king to d8, black just waits, thinks that nothing's going on. f4, for example, king e7, and now we go king f5. We start entering the position, king f7, and now bishop to f3. We have to transfer our bishop to both defend the c6 pawn, get out of the way of our king if we need to go around, and we need to be able to move our king to g5 or g4, more importantly, which is a light square, to be able to hurt the pawn forward without being harassed by the black bishop. So, for example, king e7, king to g5, king to f7, f5. Bishop to d8 check, king to f4. And now, of course, this is a hard winning procedure. It's not that simple, but as soon as the pawns move forward, as soon as this bishop is not blockading both pawns along the same diagonal, it's no longer a draw. So for example, king e4, king f6. There are, of course, several ways to win this. It's not just one winning method. This is just my analysis. Probably the engine wins faster. So for example, king e7, king d5, bishop c7, king c5, king f7, king b5, king e7, king a6, and now after king d6 or king d8, we go king b7. Once the bishop moves, we can now start pushing our pawns. We just need one Zugzwang move, so for example, bishop e4, and after bishop c7, we just push, and bishop d8, f7, he has to defend, and now c7. If king takes, I'm sorry, if the bishop moves, we promote one of the pawns, and he takes, we queen the other, and if the king moves, we do the same thing. So this is now a winning position. So after bishop to g4, moving the king out of the way and allowing the king in, or allowing the king to defend with king e4 to defend the f4 pawn would be a losing move. Therefore, king to g5 would be a risky move, because it would be hard to calculate what happens after king e6. Therefore, the safest move is simply controlling the position by keeping the bishop along this diagonal. So, for example, bishop to g3. Controlling both pawns, everything is safe. And now, if king to e4 happens, we now play king to g5. And again, the position is a simple draw. Now, this is hard to figure out unless you make mistakes that lead you to this. I mean, I'm not sure I would have understood the whole concept of not allowing the king in had I not made the mistakes myself. So try to blunder when solving this, and I think it's going to become much simpler. But basically, this position is a draw, and it's a rare case of a draw with pawns separated by two files on the bishop files. It's a rare case of a draw because the bishop is controlling both pawns and because the king is perfectly placed. Now, let's look at a random position. Whoa, wrong position. Okay, let's look at a random position that I've set up, in which the king and bishop are not ideally placed. Obviously, the bishop is not controlling both pawns. So let's see what would happen. This is again just a bit of my analysis. So king to d5. Of course, in this position, something has to be done about the bishop. If you move the king, I take it. So for example, bishop to h2, and now just c5. No blockade, no resistance, easily winning. If the pawns are on bishop files, two files apart, and there is no blockade of both pawns, then it's simple. So for example, king e7, king c6, bishop g1, trying to attack your pawn, so king d5. Again, my analysis is not perfect, but the engine would win quicker, but it's important that you understand why it's winning. It's not important to understand the exact moves. Bishop e3, bishop e4. I want to be able to defend my pawn on c6, so to make my king free. Bishop g1, and now c6, bishop b6, bishop d3, bishop a5, king c5, bishop c7, king b5, and I want to go around. Once I get to b7, I will be able to evict the bishop. So my goal is for now to get my king to a6, and if black tries to do something about that, then I will push f6. So in this position, after king d6, I can just go bishop e4, defend my pawn, king e5, attacking my bishop. And now this is a bit of tactics which I found. It was in this exact position this worked, but keep an eye out for this. Sometimes this is going to be the only way to win. In this position, yeah, king to a6. The bishop cannot be taken. If king to e4, then f6. And of course, this is bishop versus two pawns, which is a simple win. The bishop cannot defend both. If king e5, then of course f7, bishop to d6 and c7, and wins. But the point is, in this starting position, the king and bishop, even though they were in front of the pawns and they seem visually well placed, they are placed horribly. They are only controlling one pawn, and they are sort of in the way of each other. For the moment, nothing is keeping an eye out for the c pawn. And if you try, for example, bishop to d6 in the, excuse me, it's white to play. If you try, yeah, you have to move the bishop to an inferior square. But if it was black to move, if you try bishop to d6, king d5, king e7, then I could even start pushing with f6 immediately. So this position is just lost. Okay, now let's look at something a bit more complex. Okay, this is a study by Sharon from 1957. Before we get into that, I would like to look at another study by Averbach. Just a second. This is a study by Averbach from 1954, where we are going to look at a position where pawns are two files apart, which is normally an easy draw, and that's what all the theoretical books say. I would like to look at one position with the rook pawn. But it can actually be a very hard draw sometimes. Now, I mean, you shouldn't really pay attention to these two pawns. They could be relevant, but for this story, it's mostly about the king movement. But this is the best study I could find. So king d7 in this position by black. And black is going to do a weird thing where he does this with his king and does this with his bishop. And that way prevents white from entering the position and winning his a pawn. Okay, so for example, if king to c3 and king to e6 and king to d4 trying to enter the position, we now wait with our bishop, and we want to transfer the bishop to this diagonal and sort of control the key squares with our bishop while not allowing the white king in. So king c5, which seems incredibly winning, but we just play bishop to g2. And if a6, we just go back to d7. And now the king is, of course, not allowed to go to the b6 square. Or it is, but that wouldn't really do much, because after king to b6, we can go king to c8. And now again, here, king to a7 doesn't really do much, because we can just wait with bishop to h3. We just wait and stop this pawn from moving. This was the key idea. So this doesn't work. And I'll just show you what would have happened if after king to b6, black did nothing. Okay, so let's say we play bishop to h1. Now king to a7 is a winning threat. And I'll show you this idea of moving the bishop. So after king to a7, now king to c8 comes one move too late because of d7 check. And after king to d8, now we can go king to b8 and queen. Therefore, after king to b6, we went king to c8 straight away, so that after king to a7, we can transfer our bishop to h3, so that d7 is not check. Therefore, the only move white can play to make any progress is to put the king back to b6. Now, of course, if the pawn advances to a7, this pawn would be extremely easy to control. So, for example, after king c8, if you play a7, now this is a dead draw. Now, in this case, we could probably just go king to d7 and just keep our bishop on this diagonal, and no way to make progress. Okay, so after king to b6, king to c8, king to a7, bishop to h3, stopping d7 check, then the king just goes back, and then we just go back. Okay, and easy. So once the king goes out to c5, then we go to c7. Once the king goes back to d4, we go out to e6. And of course, we have to keep an eye out for the kingside pawns as well in this case. But I think this idea was very interesting, that d7 check was a good attacking resource, so we stopped it by moving our bishop along this diagonal and basically stopping the king from going into the position to e7, and then stopping the pawn from checking on d7 and getting our king out of the corner. But this study was very hard. If you want, yeah, I should have asked you to pause and try to solve it yourself before. I just wanted to show it to you as an example that if a pawn is on the rook file, it's not an immediate draw. It could be very hard to draw. So for example, in this case, if you just wait with bishop h1, you are immediately lost. You need to understand that in order to stop this king, you need to stop d7 check. So there will always be tempo tricks like that, which lure your king away from the position. So if king d8 or takes, then king b8 and wins. All right. Now let's look at what happens on knight files. Knight files are generally a draw. Okay, in most cases, a theoretical draw. Why? Because the king doesn't have enough room to maneuver. Remember how with the bishop file, the king wanted to get to b7. In this case, the king would want to get to, excuse me, a5 if the bishop was on b5. The king cannot get to a5 in this case because you don't have a minus a file. So usually with the knight pawn, the position is very tricky to win, unless, as shown in this position, the bishop is controlling the queening square. That's a huge factor. And if the pawns are advanced. And what helps is to have the knight file pawn slightly farther back to give your bishop more room to maneuver and to give your king more room to maneuver. And you want the other pawn advanced further up the board. I know that sounds complicated, and it is. But since these positions are generally drawn, these rules of thumb are good to know. Okay, so again, some analysis. Bishop e2, black waits. Bishop c5. Now this, what white is doing is very important. Just pay attention to every white move. This is a study, so again, it's very hard, but the first few moves for white are crucial. So black waits with bishop e2 or bishop f1 or bishop d3, doesn't really matter. And now what we are trying to do, if you remember the first position I showed you with bishop files, we are trying to move one of our pawns forward. Okay, what black is trying to do, black is trying to control both of our pawns somehow. So now if we played e6 in this position, black would play king takes bishop, so that doesn't work. So we would like to move either our b pawn to b5 or e pawn to e6 without losing the bishop and without losing the pawn. So if our bishop was on c5 now, we would be able to play e6 check and basically win the game. So what we play is bishop c5. So black has to defend against e6. So he plays bishop c4. And now what we have to do is we have to put black in Zugzwang. That's very easy to do. If we move our pawns, we lose the pawn and then draw the game. If we move our king, then the black king gets a better position with king e6, for example, and it should and could be a draw. Doesn't mean it is, but it would be easier to play. So we have to move our bishop. Our bishop is for the moment doing basically nothing. So we can move it to e3, f2, g1. Let's say e3. And now black is in Zugzwang. Black has to move the bishop or move the king, which either allows the b pawn to move to b5 or it allows the e pawn to move to e6. Okay, and whatever he does, one of the pawns is going to advance, and in this case win the position. In a practical game, bring you closer to victory, even if the position is a theoretical draw still, which sometimes or most of the time weaker players like me are unable to tell, which is okay. Okay, so let's say he plays bishop to b5, and now of course, since we are given a chance to advance, we advance with e6 check, king to e8, and now king e5. Now again, complicated my analysis, but bear with me. If you want to set this up with an engine and see what the best winning plan is. But basically, white is winning now with precise play. King e7, bishop g5 check. You could also, I believe, try to go king to d5. That would also work, and try to get into the position that way. But bishop g5 just seems simpler. Basically, what you do with the two bishop mate. King e8. Now, king f6 in my analysis also wins, but it seems much more complicated. This was my analysis. So I just in the end transferred my king to d6, and it became more simple. So then I just decided to just play king d6 straight away, which brings my king closer to both pawns. So why not? So he waits with bishop c4, and now we play e7. And yeah, I mean, that's it. There's just no way to prevent white from winning now. For example, bishop e2. Of course, if king f7, for example, then king d7, and if bishop b5 check, king d8, and eventually queening. King c5, the e7 pawn is of course defended. King d7, no idea of any sort for black, just waiting. b5, the pawn advances. Bishop d3, b6, the pawn advances. Bishop e4, preventing b7. But now king d4, just harassing the bishop and going towards the other side of the board. Basically, what white is trying to do now is get to f8 and win the game, and there is no way to stop the king from coming into d6 or into f8, or excuse me, more precise, into c7 or into f8, because if the king gets to one of these squares, either the bishop has to be sacrificed or the pawn promotes. So for example, bishop f3, king f6, bishop d5, king g7, bishop c6, king f8. And that's it. Yeah. Okay. So this was a very simple win because there was this Zugzwang trick and you managed to get the ideal position. Of course, everything is perfectly placed, everything is defended and nothing is blockaded, and you can set up Zugzwang and your bishop is controlling the queening square, and it's easy. But remember that these positions where the pawns are 2 files apart on bishop files are the easiest to win. When one of the pawns is on a knight file or on a rook file, it's generally much easier for the defending side to draw, because your king cannot go around and chase the bishop away from its blockading square. If you are defending these positions, where I think these techniques become much more important, remember that your first goal is to blockade both pawns with your bishop. So go in front of one of the pawns and make sure that the other pawn is attacked if it moves, and then go towards the pawn that your bishop is preventing from moving with your king. So in this case, your bishop is stopping the f3 pawn from moving to f4, so you want your king controlling f4. If you could have your king on e5 instead of g5 in this position, that would be even better, because you are closer to the other pawn as well. So these are just some general principles, but knowing them I think would help draw drawn games, draw lost games, and won games. So okay, we will continue next week with a bit more harder stuff, which is easier to win theoretically, but becomes complicated. And we are also going to start looking at positions with multiple pawns and just try to reduce them to elements we know already. Okay, thank you very much for watching. I hope you are having a great week, and stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye.